Hello and welcome to the Honest Not Perfect podcast. My name is Suzanne Ellingham and I'm the director of Source Events, the platform that helps connect retailers, brands and wholesalers to manufacturers and makers globally.
And my name is Jack Stratton. I'm director of Insider Trends. We are a global retail trend spotting agency helping brands to spot what's coming next.
Hi, my name's Suzanne and welcome to Honest Not Perfect, where we talk fashion and retail with people who are doing brilliant things or just looking at the challenges we face in a different way. It gives us the chance to really dive under the surface and get them to share their insight with a few more people. Today, I'm joined by Marguerite LeRolland, who is the Global Insight Manager for Fashion and Footwear over at Euromonitor. She oversees all research on apparel and footwear, and I mean research covering strategic analysis, covering corporate strategies, consumer trends, competitive intelligence, retail performance, and really looking at where future opportunities lie across global fashion. And I think we say it all the time, but volatility has very much become business as usual, and it's been that way probably since COVID. But I feel like over the last year, reality is since the administration change in the US, it seems to have become slightly more crazy. So we thought this would be a good time to bring Marguerite in. We've been working with Euromonitor for a few years now, and get her view on what she's seeing from a macroeconomic and a commodities perspective, and really just to give you all a few hints and tips on what could be coming around the corner. So Marguerite, welcome.
Thank you for having me.
You're welcome. I think just as a start of a 10, could you maybe give our audience a little bit of insight into what an average day looks like for you over at Euromonitor and really how you ended up where you are now?
Sure, thank you. So I come from a consulting background, so I originally worked as a consultant across many industries, delivering various projects. And then I joined Euromonitor originally as a consultant in the consulting division 14 years ago. And after a few projects in the fashion industry, I managed to move over to our syndicated research division, where I'm now specializing in the apparel and footwear market for the last 8 years. In terms of my typical day at the office, I would say it's quite diverse and different at different times of the year, but generally speaking, I might start my day having a call with some colleagues in Asia, our offices in Shanghai or Tokyo, for example, or Singapore, and then catching up with obviously the colleagues in Europe. We are based in London, and then a little later have a call or some brainstorm with some clients in the US or Latin America. So we have a very broad geographic reach, which is really insightful and makes my days very rich, because we're able to reach out to these insights locally through people who speak different languages, are different parts of the world, and really have their boots on the ground to tell us what's hot in different countries.
It sounds like whereas the structure may be similar, it sounds like different things on different days. No 2 days are really ever the same.
Exactly.
Which I feel like many people we work with can possibly relate to. Obviously, there's lots of changes happening in the world at the moment. What would you say are the big supply side shifts that you're seeing at the moment? What is happening that you're super interested in the world?
Yeah, very good question. I think it's fair to say since COVID, we have seen supply chain shifts, but all of these, if anything, is accelerating. I think we've seen a few manufacturers, a few brands looking at limiting and reducing their reliance on China and looking at other markets and countries for their supply chains. But that said, China today is still about 47% of the world textile and leather goods production. So it's hard to move away from China for economic reasons and as well as infrastructure reasons. Not all market can absorb the volumes that China is producing.
Do you, because we hear this quite a lot around retailers and brands who are genuinely looking to nearshore. Have you seen a change in data to say that's really happening?
I think it is happening. So that's what we've seen is without leaving Asia completely, a lot of international players have put in place regional supply chains where they have shorter leads, shorter time to stores, and it's really a way to mitigate their risk and making sure if there is some disruption in one part of the world, it doesn't stop the whole business. It means they're still able to supply some of their key markets through other supply chain hubs. I think there's also, in the case, for example, I'm thinking of mango, they have what they put twin tracks, where they would have maybe a longer track for their supply chain in Asia that produces classic items, and for the on-trade items that they need shorter leads for, they will produce closer to Europe, like Turkey or even Portugal, North Africa. Similarly, they've put something in place like that in Latin America, so Brazil and Mexico in particular, to supply the US market. So I think this is a good example of some of the shifts we're seeing in the supply chains.
And I think certainly within Source Fashion's bubble, we've been seeing that for a little while. We're seeing large-scale retailers with their volume production in China and India, but very much looking at their trend-led styles that need to be quick to market, i.e. within 3 months. Those are absolutely being looked at much closer to home, and people are genuinely looking at more of that blended mix. I think what's interesting, I'd love to see it if you could share, is actually that data around how are people genuinely moving away from China, because I always think there's the say-do gap, what people say, what they do. And I think we've been hearing this for a long time, but I would say we only really started seeing it within the show in maybe January, where we really saw people interested in closer to home. So I find it super fascinating that there's data that actually is saying that the amount of fashion that China produces is actually materially decreasing.
It is, but as you're right to say, there's a gap between what we hear, what we read about in the press, and actual data. I check the data before I talk, and what we see is, for example, before COVID, maybe China was about 53% of the world production. We are now at around 47%. So it has declined, but it's declining quite slowly.
6% of world fashion is still...
It's a big volume.
It's a huge volume. But in general production overall, it's probably not as impactful as we believe it could be. So moving away from supply chain and where people are sourcing from, and looking at different regions of the world who do different things, what do you see being the biggest pressure point commodity-wise? Is it cotton? Is it energy? Is it logistics? What do you think is causing some of the cost pressures on garment production?
I think it's a mix of all what you said, really. Unfortunately, the world has been really dynamic. We are really in an era of what we call polycrisis, and the fashion industry being so global is directly impacted by all the geopolitical and macroeconomic shocks we see. So at the moment, I would say with the oil crisis, the situation between the US and Iran, we see a double impact on the fashion industry. One, because like a lot of other industries, the freight and shipping costs are going up.
Which is the obvious one that people think of.
Exactly. But in the case of fashion, as you know, there's also material cost implication, because a lot of the garments are now relying on man-made synthetic fibers that are derived from oil. So we see a double impact for the fashion industry, which now the buying teams and the strategic teams are trying to plan accordingly, so trying to mitigate their risks, trying to become more literate when it comes to commodity, to logistics, but obviously it takes some time and you can't change overnight. So I think, again, these supply chain shifts we've seen, developing more regional hubs, diversifying maybe also the sort of materials that are being used, is something in motion, but it's not going to happen overnight.
No. And I think sometimes there is a view that, certainly if we look at oil, because I think there's no chance of that going down anytime soon. I can't see a scenario where it doesn't continue to increase. I think there is a tendency for people to think straight to shipping. But when do you think people will start to feel that double impact, as in the impact on materials? And to caveat that, some of the conversations I've had in the last 2 weeks are indicating that material costs in China are already starting to increase because they're one of the biggest producers of those man-made synthetic fibres. When do you think people will start to feel that? Do you think they've got a few months' grace before they have to really start planning or acting?
I think there is always a lag, but I think we'll start seeing that in the unit prices on the shelves very soon. Some big companies have already warned that there would be price increases, especially in the sportswear universe, where the use of synthetic fibers is...
technical fabrics.
Exactly. With that said, it's going to be interesting because I think one of the strategies we'll see as well from these market players who will have to raise some of their prices. We'll see these elevation strategy and premiumization strategies that we have seen again in the last few years. I think will accelerate because it's going to be a way to justify these higher prices to consumers. So really stress on the technical features, the materials, the performance of longevity and durability of the piece of garment or the pair of shoes that you're buying. That I think that will be communicated more and more actively to consumers to justify these price increases that I think the market players will have to implement very soon.
So essentially, we're going to see, which is not a major surprise, but we're going to start to see more of that premiumization messaging at store level. And I always kind of feel that some stores do storytelling really incredibly well and others don't. But I think the difference will be how well they get that through to their customers will be actually where those customers choose to buy from, because they won't necessarily accept a price increase from every retailer. So I think we'll see a really interesting view on where consumers choose to spend as to who's told that story better.
Exactly, and that's where the physical store will also be very important, because it's such an important part of the storytelling of the offering these touch points with the brand, with the product, and being able to convey the value that you are putting in the products you sell. Not to mention the services around the product as well. So
we were touching on that earlier. It's services, and we'll definitely come to this later on. But actually, how brands are enhancing that customer experience through service and increasing those regular touch points that build a value beyond the price of a product. Just to take a tiny step back, we were speaking earlier around the lag. So the lag of when commodity prices start to increase, or when we see those early signals that there's going to be some changes in the world that is going to impact businesses. How commodity literate do you think an average buying team is?
To be honest,
Really chicken and egg question.
That's a difficult one. I think traditionally that was not the focus of the buying team, maybe. But increasingly, because of all these events that have taken place in the world for the last few years, this is a topic of growing interest, and I feel like there's more initiative even for the next generation of buyers and designers to have this awareness and literacy in commodity pricing and how to design items to be more durable. This is also pushed by the regulation with the eco-design regulation that's coming into place in Europe. But I think there are different initiatives to increase these awareness and literacy in commodity pricing and designing product differently.
Yeah, I think one of the reasons that I'm always curious about this is that if we think of what an average buyer was looking at maybe 10 years ago, their role was quite different. But I feel as we are now just living in an environment that is so volatile when it comes to planning and unit prices, and actually just the overall cost of range and production, I feel like this is something that anybody who has any interest in fashion needs to have some sense of awareness of, because we all know that many things can impact commodity prices. It could be oil prices, it could be part of the world being blocked, it could also be climate crisis driving the cost of cotton up, which will impact you next year. And I think this is one of these places where when we talk to people and we talk about research, this always feels to be one of the gaps, one of the knowledge gaps. And I think what I'd be curious to know from your side is, What do you feel are kind of any of the myths or misconceptions, or how can this be kind of easily translated? Where can people find, obviously Euromonitor, where can people find sources just to really help them understand some of these things a little bit easier or a little more clearly to them?
I think they can, follow specialists into specific commodities. The textile exchange is also a really useful source. And in general, I think there is a greater offering from events such as your own event about these, how commodity pricing works and what's the impact on the final price of a garment. I feel this is becoming more of interest, and there's more offering around that topic coming from the key event organizers as well as universities and yes, the press as well. You can find because it's a hot topic. I feel the press has been discussing this more openly as well. And
I think it's just becoming more important for people to understand how that's going to impact them. So, for example, when we saw the oil conflict in the Middle East, and then we saw that, we very quickly realised that that's going to have a knock-on effect, but that's not going to be next week. It's maybe 2 months, and then we start to see increases, which gives people a little bit of time. I have a question for you, and this isn't one that I prepared. What is your early indicator? So for me, when I'm looking at things that are going to cause significant shifts, like the early indicator that I look at, strangely, is container costs, like shipping costs. That gives me a good view that actually if they're starting to slowly increase, that it's going to have significant impact. Have you got any indicators that you look at that kind of is, if you see something spike or something change, that kind of just pricks a few spider senses?
Yeah, there's a couple. So, for example, we have monthly price index for key commodities at Euromonitor, and we're already seeing the crude oil prices have gone up significantly since February, from 94 to 120. So similarly, we see some knock-on effect already on cotton. Cotton prices have gone up as well from around, the index was around 74 in February. We're now at around 85. Okay. So these are indicators that these early signals you discussed before, these are early signals for us. Then in terms of the industry signals, I would say it's all these investor calls, and when we hear some of our biggest clients or biggest names in the industry mentioning that there will be price increases, for us that's a strong signal. Then there is a lag between these announcements and when we see the prices change in store and when we see consumers feel it. The same way when inflation was very high, there was maybe a lag of 2-3 months before people
start to see
felt
increases.
It, but we are heading that way with the signals we're seeing now.
And just because I sometimes have moments, in terms of the relationship between the oil prices and the cotton prices, is that a matter of more and more cost? Is that the material side? So people are moving away from man-made fibres and wanting to invest in cotton and more organic fibres, or is there another slightly more intelligent reason behind it?
Well, my interpretation is that, people are already starting to look for alternatives. And so maybe looking for more natural fibers because of the sustainability narrative, but also the economic reality, which is synthetic fibers are getting more expensive. So I'm going to hurry up and secure a certain order of cotton before everyone else does. So it's just the law of demand and supply. So when one of the key commodity is not as desirable as before, that demand gets shifted to another commodity.
I mean, for me, as somebody who's quite interested in responsible production and sustainability, and also looking at the circularity at the back end, anything that moves people towards natural organic fibres and materials is a great thing. So despite the fact it's not necessarily the best of circumstances, because you don't want to be forced to make a decision like that before you're ready, knowing that people are already starting to move to add in more of those organic materials into their supply base is generally positive.
I feel like every crisis is an opportunity to reinvent yourself and to possibly fix something that were not right. So if we have these crisis that helps fashion accelerate its shift from synthetic to more natural fibers, and ideally towards investing as well in regenerative fibers, regenerative farming. That would be amazing. And let's not forget the regulation in Europe is also pushing towards that with the eco-design regulation, but we also mentioned, for example, we should also mention the digital product passport, which will force brands and manufacturers to disclose how their item has been manufactured. And therefore, maybe this regionalization of supply chain will also be communicated more actively to customers and be a key selling point.
Yeah, I think I've started to see the digital product passports on clothes. And I was talking to a colleague, somebody we work with, who'd been to an event and had scanned a Stella McCartney handbag. Wasn't me, I wasn't buying a Stella McCartney. I wish. But the interesting thing is, I think it's going to force consumers, not necessarily force, give them the opportunity to be curious about their clothes, where they're made, where they're really made, where the materials come from. And I think what I'm interested in is all of those brands who, say, for example, are using made in Italy or made in Portugal, but actually a substantial amount of their production is coming from elsewhere in the world and being finished in a specific place. And I also tag in made in the UK for that as well. You essentially just need to stick a label on something or finish a seam and you can claim it's completely made in Britain. So I think what's interesting with the digital product passport is, I think what I'm curious about is consumer reaction, because I think I've told people, a few of them have started, a few of my family have started to see little QR codes, and I think people get curious. And I'd be really interested to see if there is almost a brand backlash when people can see where their clothes are clearly made and that actually doesn't align with the values of that brand as it's perceived. There are some, certainly within the UK, some big UK heritage brands that are made in the UK actually only produce 3 items in the UK now. So I think it'll be interesting. The digital product passport, I think, will be transformational for giving supply chain visibility. I'd be super interested to see what happens when those consumers start getting interested in where their clothes are made and actually ask where the price tag comes from for those pieces.
Yeah, that's going to be very interesting indeed. And I think that's also why brands and manufacturers had a few years to get ready for it, and maybe, change a couple of things before it became public knowledge. And I think, but that's definitely going to be interesting to see what consumers really care about, and probably the made in UK, made in Italy label, which has been used in luxury goods. It's going to have to premiumize the luxury goods in certain brands. It's going to be put to the test with these new regulation, and I think we'll see how it unfolds. But I think the digital product passport, in that sense, is forcing transparency, and according to our consumer surveys at Euromonitor, we see that matters a lot, especially for the younger consumers. Yeah. Again, there might be an action gap, a belief, a gap between what people say they care about and what they really buy. But in terms of intentions, we clearly see transparency matters to a lot of consumers.
And I think whilst those younger consumers are young at the moment, give it 5 or 10 years and they will make up the majority of the economic spending power in this country. So I think transparency is incredibly important to those younger consumers, and also, strangely, some of our older consumers as well. But I think anybody who's not looking at that transparency is and really thinking about the story that they're telling and where they're laying their values, I think it's definitely going to be an interesting one when people can see where something is completely made. Mm-hmm. Obviously, with a lot of things happening, you've mentioned that you work with a lot of major fashion players. Are there any businesses that you think are actually managing the risk and the general volatility in the world really well? I think I've got a few companies that I'm definitely admiring at the moment, but from your side, who do you think generally is managing this well, and do you think there's any secret sauce in the reasons behind that?
What I would say, for example, the Inditex group has done really well. They have lots of different brands in their portfolio, so I think they've premiumized a lot. Zara, their core brand, with these pricing, flagship store strategy, where they really told a story about the brand and elevated also the designs. Most recently announcing this collaboration with John Galliano. At the same time, they are able to leverage more affordable brands of their portfolio, like Bershka or Lefties, and they're expanding Lefties actively in the UK. They've opened a third shop, for example. So the concept's been successful in Spain and now is expanding across other markets. And they're also playing on the demand for sportswear with Oysho. They reinvented the Oysho concept and really positioned it strongly, first with the winter sports, and now it's a lot about running and encouraging women to run. So I think with this multi-layer portfolio, multi-brand portfolio, and different pricing strategies, they've managed to weather the crisis very well so far.
Yeah, I think it also, I think in the UK we see a lot of examples of quite large retailers going into administration all the time. And I think seeing somebody like Inditex, who has that mix of value and mid-level and luxury, actually all of the parts of that group are performing quite well. And it kind of makes you look at why are they performing well, and actually what could people learn from that group that, say, for example, LK Bennett, you know, they're essentially a premium at the higher end of women's retail in the UK. And when we look at that, you say, by all accounts, they should be thriving, but there are certain things within their operating model, within their sourcing and strategy, that just didn't work. So in some ways, it's actually quite nice to look at a group the size of Inditex and think, okay, what are they doing? It's like they're thriving. And does it just come down to they understand who their customers are, what they want, and actually just really good at telling them that's what they're giving them?
Yeah, I think there's definitely an element of that, and I think they did not only premiumize in terms of, you know, increasing prices, they did invest a lot in the customer experience. So they invested in new flagship stores, in revamping some existing stores. They also invested on digital platforms to make it more engaging, and I think this is definitely where the brand loyalty comes from. Is they've invested a lot in the customer experience to elevate the brand, not only increase prices without any changes. And I think consumers can tell. They will follow, I think, and they will be willing to pay more for a brand if they feel they pay the right value for it. And in the Zara equation, I think the amount invested justified the price increases, and consumers felt like it.
No, I think when we look at what good looks like, I think Zara is a good example of what good looks like. But I also think that they've heavily invested in their sourcing and their actual supply chain, and also heavily invested in their de-risking around ESPR as well. So I think one of the reasons that I look to that group, and I think that's interesting, is that they're doing, whilst they are effectively, parts of that group are fast fashion and volume production, actually they're making a lot of steps forward in terms of how they're dealing with their waste, how they're making efficiencies in their supply chain. And I think if you look under the surface of it, there's some really interesting things happening within that group. I think one of the interesting indicators for me, and I think it came out of Zara, see the Zara Mango, and this was about 2 weeks ago, is they published that their total waste on their ranges is about 0.8%. Which I actually took a double take at, and I now know that I can't remember exactly which group it was, but the stat was significant because the average waste of unsold ranges in the average UK retail is about 14%. So it shows actually what they're doing is they're looking at ESPR, they're looking at the regulations that are coming through, and they've already done digital product passport, and they've already done a significant amount of work in terms of making efficiencies within their supply chain, at the same time as increasing these kind of touch points with their customers and really meeting them where they are. So I think in terms of when we look at what good looks like, I think they're doing some things incredibly well. And in a way, I think I wish they were more public facing in terms of sharing a little bit more around what they do with the industry. Because I feel like that's one of the places where, certainly within fashion compared to a lot of other industries, where there isn't necessarily as much sharing between stakeholders, still feels quite competitive as opposed to collaborative when it comes to some of those infrastructure size changes.
That's true. I think some initiatives, or the Ellen MacArthur Foundation, for example, is doing a great job in trying to get these industry players all together and share what they've learned on a specific project to be more sustainable. But that hasn't scaled yet, not enough to change the industry. But all what you said about Inditex and Mango taking different steps to reduce their environmental footprint, I think it's great. And what's also very interesting is it's easier to find this information, I feel, than a few years ago, because they prepared for the upcoming regulation that is changing. They prepared for more transparency, for more changes in the way they dispose of their waste or the way they design clothing. They invested a lot into that, but they also decided to communicate more about it because to increase return on investments, to have this story to tell to also their customers, not only the regulators or the auditors, but making sure this is a holistic view and the nice story you can tell about your efforts are public knowledge.
I think it's also a lesson in trying to get ahead of potential regulation before you end up in a situation where you aren't prepared for it. Quite concerningly, we were having a conversation with a lawyer in the UK who essentially said her advice to UK businesses was not to worry about EPR, to which I said, this woman's never talking at my show ever again. It's like, we can't have that kind of advice. It's like, if you're not looking at EPR or ESPR and you're not looking at these regulations, then actually are you really de-risking your business? Because they're going to come through at some point, and actually it's much better to know, to have complete transparency of what you're doing, but also be taking strides towards reducing waste, because it's only going to be a cost benefit in the future. So I think it's in the UK, I feel like there is, because we've been so anti-regulation around environmental, around actually most things, I feel like it's almost a shock when it comes around, and it's almost, oh, well, we'll do that when it comes to it. But these regulations are coming through. And I think companies like Inditex, who started really looking at this 10, 15 years ago, are now ahead of the curve. And when we now start to take a look at, there is quite a large amount of regulation coming through in the next kind of 18 months. I don't think that's going to get delayed again and again. I think it's here. And if business aren't really looking at having complete transparency across their supply base, and some are doing that quite well, but also really managing the waste element. It's like, how are we producing what we can sell? How well do we know our data? How well do we know our customers? When these prices need to increase, how are we communicating that? And I think some businesses have been thinking about that for a lot longer than certainly some of the UK-based retailers that we work with.
Yeah, and I think you're right. It's about being ready, because I think the regulation will come. Some implementation has been postponed, but like some regulation is already effective. Yeah. We know the digital product passport, etc., will really be rolled out in 2027. You've already seen some QR codes on different labels. So I think the more ready a brand is, the better, just because otherwise it's reactive. Yeah. It's not the story you want to tell, it's what is being exposed of your labor and environmental practices potentially. And in any case, that can only damage your reputation, while if you've put things in place, you're more in control of your own narrative, and that can only be beneficial to avoid fines and penalties, but also to tell the story you want to tell to customers.
I think that's a great way to end that point, because I think you want to be in charge of the story you want to tell to your customers. So last question, if you had a crystal ball, what would you be looking at or for the next 6 months? Like, what do you see happening? Are there any particular changes you think, actually, if I was a fashion or a retailer now and I was looking 6 months in time, would you expect any significant changes? What would you be interested in?
Very good question again. I think what we will see more of is this market polarization, where we will see more brands elevating their offering to justify higher prices, because that's how you can justify the value of your brand and your items. I also think we will see also more interesting experiences in stores, but also more maybe local engagement driven initiatives. We know, for example, some of the most successful running sportswear brands at the moment have built this loyalty around free run clubs, open to all, and it's proved massively successful. So it was not only about investing in sponsoring key teams or major events, it was being present for the local community, and I think this is becoming extremely important for consumers.
I think I saw a case on this morning, which was Nike and Gymshark, and it was around Nike's strategy for online communities and building clubs, and Gymshark have recently opened a gym in New York, and it's actually about having that physical presence in the community that you care about, and Gymshark do a huge amount of things really well with their community and their customer base, but I feel like one of the places where they've doubled down is like they do gym. So why wouldn't they build a gym? It's like, makes perfect sense, and their customers will love it.
Yeah, and it's really a place or something people look forward to. Similarly with some of the run clubs by Hoka or On, you can meet up with other runners, make new friends, or motivate each other and meet up at a certain given point in the city, go for a run, and I think this is proving really successful with a lot of consumers.
Yeah, I think people like connecting with their tribes, so I would love to see more of that. Anyway,
and I think we'll see more of this, definitely, given that fashion brands will be rethinking what value do I bring with everything around the world being so uncertain. What do customers want? They want to belong, they want to feel looked after, they want to have little treats, look after themselves. So self-care is also an important part of the narrative that fashion is embracing. Self-care, lifestyle, and being part of a community will definitely be really important.
I think that's a hugely positive point to end on. Thank you so much, Marguerite, and we look forward to seeing you at the show in July as well.
Pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.